The idea of the circular flow diagram as a way of looking at the economy was introduced back in Lecture 3. If you remember, that diagram had two main groups of actors in the economy, households and firms, and the households and firms were interacting in three main markets, in markets for goods, markets for labor, and markets for financial capital. The previous lectures have mainly been working through the idea of markets for goods and how they operate. In this lecture, we want to shift to the market for labor. The economy is commonly described by what is produced, but it's really equally valid to think about the economy as the patterns of the working people who carry out that production. I sometimes say the U.S. economy is what happens when 130 million people get up and go to work each day. Now, of course, this idea of what is consumed and what are produced is really just two different perspectives on the same overall set of interactions. Just one is looking at the economy from the standpoint of what the firms make, and the other is looking at it from the standpoint of who they hire. Supply and demand is the key to understanding labor markets, just as it is with markets for goods. But there's one major difference as you work your way through the intuition. In goods markets, firms are the suppliers of goods, and households and individuals are the demand for goods. But in the labor market, individuals are the suppliers of labor, and businesses are the demanders of labor. In the labor market, instead of talking about the price of each different good, we talk about the wage or the salary that the worker receives, but that serves the same economic function as the price in the goods market. Just as there are many, many different goods for all different kinds of goods and services with different kinds of characteristics, the market for labor is really many different markets as well. And it has different characteristics for each worker. There could be a market for nurses, a market for firefighters, a market for all the different kinds of jobs. So when you're jumping between markets for goods and markets for labor, you do have to keep these differences in intuition straight. But if you can keep those concepts straight, then the two markets are analyzed in precisely the same way. So let's walk through it for the labor market. Demand for labor is a relationship. In this case, the relationship is between the wage or the salary paid and the quantity of work that employers demand as they're trying to hire people to make their products. A higher wage will tend to make businesses demand a lower quantity of labor, just in the same way that a lower price tends to make consumers demand less of a good. At an intuitive level, this ought to make some sense. Firms are trying to make money. If the cost of labor goes up and up, firms will try to find some ways to cut back on labor. And perhaps they'll be able to substitute some kind of machinery or physical capital, or figure out another method of producing whatever it is they're producing. Well, just how much will an increase in wages reduce the quantity of labor demanded? That will depend, of course, on the elasticity, which works in labor markets just like it does in goods markets. Some firms will have a fairly inelastic demand for labor. That is, a 10% rise in wages would lead to a less than 10% drop in the quantity of labor hired. Some firms will have an elastic demand for labor. A 10% rise in wages would lead to a more than 10% drop in the quantity of labor hired. In many cases, demand for labor will be fairly inelastic in the short run. Firms sort of have hired who they've hired, they're going to work with who they've got, but potentially the demand for labor can be much more elastic in the long run, when firms have a chance to reorganize production. For example, firms might come up with some whole new kind of technology which allows them to get rid of a whole lot of workers if they've got the time and the incentive to do so. So, back to our trick questions. Trick question: what moves demand for labor? The answer is not the wage. Not the wage. The wage changes the quantity of labor demanded, but remember that demand is the amount of labor demanded at any given price, not at one specific price. So what sort of factors could change the demand for labor at every price, at every wage which would be paid? One factor, for example, is new technology. Historically, going back a couple of centuries now, there's been a major fear that the development of new technology would diminish the demand for labor and drive down wages for all workers. Well, this may have been plausible sort of in the middle of the 19th century, but now we've had about 2 centuries of major technological innovation. And the real lesson seems to be that technology causes labor to be moved and displaced from one industry to another. Certain industries are made obsolete by new technology, but the new technology also helps to create new industries and create jobs. And on average, the use of that new technology makes labor more productive. So the result of the new technology is a shift in the labor market, but it's a shift that results in just about as many jobs, if not more, and also in higher average wages. The changes in demand for different kinds of outputs will also alter the demand for certain kinds of labor. There's a friend of mine, for example, who a few years ago thought that massage therapy was the next big upcoming thing, and he went through a course for massage therapy and became, I think, quite expert at it. But he's not getting hired anywhere because recently demand for massage therapy in his part of the country went down somewhat. You can also think of certain skills like, say, playing the classical violin, where demand for the good or service will determine the extent to which firms are willing to hire, or in that case, orchestras are willing to hire. Ultimately, the willingness of firms to hire workers depends on how much the labor is going to produce. It depends on the productivity of labor. After all, if workers don't produce enough to justify their wage, firms won't hire them. Now, let's think this through in terms of a couple of examples. If workers were producing a lot more than their wage, and don't we all feel one time or another as a worker that we're producing a lot more than our wage, then it should be true in a market that some other firm will come along, hire that worker, and give the worker a raise. Over time, and on average, wages are going to be determined by the value of what labor produces. Now, let's think about supply of labor. Again, supply is a relationship to economists. In this case, supply is a relationship between the wage and the quantity of work supplied or provided by workers. A higher wage would typically mean a higher quantity of labor supplied. Now, at an intuitive level, this should make some sense. A higher wage makes it more attractive to work, and so there'll be a little bit more of a quantity supplied of labor. Precisely how much will an increase in the wage increase the quantity of labor supplied? Well, that depends on our friend, the elasticity of labor supply. For many full-time workers in the economy, and by full-time workers I mean sort of workers who are working about 40 hours a week, labor supply is pretty inelastic. That is, a 10% increase in their wages leads to less than a 10% increase in their work hours. However, many full-time workers don't actually have a lot of ability to adjust their hours of labor, so it's not quite clear whether this is their choice or not. As a first approximation, though, it's probably true to say higher wages don't change the quantity of labor supplied by very much for full-time adult workers. However, for part-time workers, or workers who are providing a secondary income for their family, or teenage workers, labor supply is probably more elastic. That is, for that group, a 10% increase in wages might easily lead to more than a 10% increase in hours of work. Trick question. You should be getting used to my trick questions now. What causes the supply of labor to shift? The answer is not the wage. Wage doesn't cause supply to shift. The labor supply covers a whole range of wages and a whole range of salaries. When the wage changes, the quantity supplied of labor shifts, but the supply itself doesn't move. Now, what sort of factors might affect the supply of labor in a way that would cause the entire labor supply curve to shift? Well, some possibilities might include things like changes in population. As the population gets bigger, there's going to be more labor supplied at any given wage or salary. There can also be shifts in the demographics of a population. For example, when a population is very young, it's typical to believe that, in general, those workers might not be highly attached to the workforce. Or if the population, much of it is exceptionally old, again, there's a sense that many people might be on the edge of retirement. But if a lot of population is sort of right in the middle of their peak earning years, kind of that period from maybe 30 up to 55, that's a group where, with that demographics, the population is going to have a pretty good supply of labor for any given wage level. Now, another difference could be shifts in social expectations about who is expected to work. For example, in the 1970s, there was a massive entry of women into the paid workforce. Many women who'd been working in the household sector decided, in one reason or another, to go off and get paid jobs. That was a dramatic shift in the supply of labor the economy had at every given wage or price. There are many different types of markets for different types of labor that are all going to have different skills and characteristics. And again, you can think about those in some ways in terms of jobs, like markets for nurses, markets for people who cut hair, markets for engineers, markets for economists. In each market, the equilibrium wage will be determined by where the quantity of labor supplied is equal to the quantity of labor demanded in that particular market. For example, let's think about a given market like the labor market for skilled nurses in a certain metropolitan area. If it was true that the wage was below the equilibrium level, then that low wage means that the quantity demanded is going to be pretty high. The low wage encourages hospitals to hire, but the quantity supplied is likely to be fairly low because of the low wage. A shortage develops. The quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, and wages of nurses will be bid up in that local market toward the equilibrium level. What about in that local market if the wage was above the equilibrium level? In that case, then, with that high wage, the quantity supplied is likely to be quite high, but the quantity demanded of nurses may not be as high. Hospitals may try and figure out ways to economize on nurses and hire, rather than skilled nurses, perhaps hire healthcare workers who don't quite get paid as much or have quite that skill set. They may be able to substitute technology for nurses in some cases. So in that situation, the quantity supplied is high, the quantity demanded is perhaps not as high. There'll be a surplus of skilled nurses trying to get jobs. And over time, the wage will tend to fall in that labor market or not rise as much for a time. Again, equilibrium happens when you hit the situation where quantity demanded and quantity supplied within that market are equal to each other. And that'll be the balancing point where one doesn't expect the wages to change dramatically. Now, with this sort of supply and demand for labor framework in our minds, let's now contemplate a few different applications of this framework. Other applications are going to come up in later lectures, like when we talk about inequality of income or unemployment. Those are outcomes of labor markets in some ways. But here I want to focus on some things that are specific to the supply and demand framework. The labor market can offer some useful insights into policy issues like the minimum wage, the effect of labor unions, discrimination in labor markets, and how to think about employee benefits. Those are the four issues I want to try and walk through here. Again, my emphasis is not so much on drawing conclusions about these, but in how one might think about these issues as you talk about them and as you discuss them. So, minimum wage first. There are perennial arguments. Since the 1930s, when a minimum wage was first adopted at the national level, there are perennial arguments over whether to raise the minimum wage and how much to raise the minimum wage. What is a minimum wage exactly? A minimum wage is a law that all workers must be paid a certain hourly wage. Thus, it's a price floor. It's a price floor in the sense that, by law, an employer cannot pay less than that amount. And according to the arguments about price floors that were developed in Lecture 4, one would expect that it would lead to a situation where there's a shortage of employers willing to offer low-skilled jobs. Lots of people will be willing to supply their labor at the minimum wage, but perhaps not so many firms will be willing to hire at that minimum wage. And indeed, there's some evidence that about a 10% rise in the minimum wage can often lead to 1 or 2% more unemployment for low-skilled workers. But that effect, that 1 or 2%, is really quite small. And in some studies, the effect is zero, that the increase in the minimum wage is not observed to lead to any decrease in the unemployment rate or in the employment rate for low-skilled workers. This suggests that in the United States, at least, the minimum wage is not being set at a really, really high level above the equilibrium wage. If the minimum wage is way above the equilibrium wage, we should start to run into that problem where lots and lots of people want to work at that minimum wage, but there's not much willingness to hire them. If the minimum wage is pretty much at the wage that would prevail anyway, or maybe just a little bit above it, then it's not going to create a whole lot of unemployment. And that seems to be more the situation that the U.S.